The Battle of Tours, Part 2. In addition to his cardinal military virtues, Abdurrahman is described by the Arab writers as a model of integrity and justice. The first 2 years of his second administration in Spain were occupied in severe reforms of the abuses which under his predecessors had crept into the system of government, and in extensive preparations for his intended conquest of Gaul. Besides the troops which he collected from his province, he obtained from Africa a large body of chosen Berber cavalry, officered by Arabs of proved skill and valor, and in the summer of 732 he crossed the Pyrenees at the head of an army which some Arab writers rate at 80,000 strong, while some of the Christian chroniclers swell its numbers to many hundreds of thousands. Probably the Arab account diminishes, but of the two keeps nearer to the truth. It was from this formidable host, after Eudes, the Count of Aquitaine, had vainly striven to check it, after many strong cities had fallen before it, and half the land been overrun, that Gaul and Christendom were at last rescued by the strong arm of Prince Charles, who acquired a surname, like that of the war god of his forefathers' creed, from the might with which he broke and shattered his enemies in the battle. His surname that he acquired was Martel, or the Hammer. The Merovingian kings had sunk into absolute insignificance and had become mere pulpits of royalty before the 8th century. Charles Martel, like his father Pepin Herstal, was Duke of the Austrasian Franks, the bravest and most thoroughly Germanic part of the nation, and exercised in the name of the titular king what little paramount authority the turbulent minor rulers of districts and towns could be persuaded or compelled to acknowledge. Engaged with his national competitors in perpetual conflicts for power, engaged also in more serious struggles for safety against the fierce tribes of the unconverted Frisians, Bavarians, Saxons, and Thuringians, who at that epoch assailed with particular ferocity the Christianized Germans on the left bank of the Rhine, Charles Martel added experienced skill to his natural courage, and he had also formed a militia of veterans among the Franks. Hallam has thrown out a doubt whether, in our admiration of his victory at Tours, we do not judge a little too much by the event, and whether there was not rashness in his risking the fate of France on the result of a general battle with the invaders. But when we remember that Charles had no standing army, and the independent spirit of the Frank warriors who followed his standard, it seems most probable that it was not in his power to adopt the cautious policy of watching the invaders and wearing out their strength by delay. So dreadful and widespread were the ravages of the Saracenic light cavalry throughout Gaul that it must have been impossible to restrain for any length of time the indignant ardor of the Franks. And even if Charles could have persuaded his men to look tamely on while the Arabs stormed more towns and desolated more districts, he could not have kept an army together when the usual period of a military expedition had expired. If indeed the Arab account of the disorganization of the Moslem forces be correct, the battle was well timed on the part of Charles, as it was, beyond all question, well fought. The monkish chroniclers from whom we are obliged to glean a narrative of this memorable campaign bear full evidence to the terror which the Saracen invasion inspired, and to the agony of that great struggle. The Saracens, they say, and their king, who was called Abderamis, came out of Spain with all their wives and their children, and their substance, in such great multitudes that no man could reckon or estimate them. They brought with them all their armor and whatever they had, as if they were henceforth always to dwell in France. Then Abdurrahman, seeing the land filled with the multitude of his army, pierces through the mountains, tramples over rough and level ground, plunders far into the country of the Franks, and smites all with the sword, insomuch that when Edu came to battle with him at the river Garonne and fled before him, God alone knows the number of the slain. Then Abdurrahman pursued after Count Edu, and while he strives to spoil and burn the holy shrines at Tours, he encounters the chief of the Austrasian Franks, Charles, a man of war from his youth up, to whom Edo had sent warning. There for nearly 7 days they strive intensely, and at last they set themselves in battle array, and the nations of the north, standing firm as a wall and impenetrable as a zone of ice, utterly slay the Arabs with the edge of the sword. The European writers all concur in speaking of the fall of Abdurrahman as one of the principal causes of the defeat of the Arabs, who, according to one writer, after finding that their leader was slain, dispersed in the night, to the agreeable surprise of the Christians, who expected the next morning to see them issue from their tents and renew the combat. One monkish chronicler puts the loss of the Arabs at 375,000 men, while he says that only 1,007 Christians fell, a disparity of loss which he feels bound to account for by a special interposition of Providence. I have translated above some of the most spirited passages of these writers, but it is impossible to collect from them anything like a full or authentic description of the great battle itself, or of the operations which preceded or followed it. Though, however, we may have cause to regret the meagerness and doubtful character of these narratives, we have the great advantage of being able to compare the accounts given of Abdurrahman's expedition by the national writers of each side. This is a benefit which the inquirer into antiquity so seldom can obtain, that the fact of possessing it, in the instance of the battle at Tours, makes us think the historical testimony respecting that great event more certain and satisfactory than is the case in many other instances, where we possess abundant details respecting military exploits, but where those details come to us from the annalists of one nation only, and where we have, consequently, no safeguard against the exaggerations, the distortions, and the fictions which national vanity has so often put forth in the garb and under the title of history. The Arabian writers who recorded the conquests and wars of their countrymen in Spain have narrated also the expedition into Gaul of their great emir, and his defeat and death near Tours in battle with the host of the Franks under King Caldus, the name into which they metamorphose Charles. They tell us how there was war between the Count of the Frankish frontier and the Moslems, and how the Count gathered together all his people and fought for a time with doubtful success. But, say the Arabian chroniclers, Abdurrahman drove them back, and the men of Abdurrahman were puffed up in spirit by their repeated successes, and they were full of trust in the valor and the practice in war of their emir. So the Moslems smote their enemies and passed the river Garonne and laid waste the country and took captives without number. And that army went through all places like a desolating storm. Prosperity made those warriors insatiable. At the passage of the river, Abdurrahman overthrew the Count, and the Count retired into his stronghold. But the Moslems fought against it and entered it by force and slew the Count. For everything gave way to their scimitars, which were the robbers of lives. All the nations of the Franks trembled at that terrible army, and they betook them to their king Caldus, and told him of the havoc made by the Moslem horsemen, and how they rode at their will through all the land of Narbonne, Toulouse, and Bordeaux. And they told the king of the death of their count. Then the king bade them of good cheer, and offered to aid them. And in the 114th year he mounted his horse, and he took with him a host that could not be numbered, and went against the Moslems. And he came upon them at the great city of Tours, and Abdurrahman and other prudent cavaliers saw the disorder of the Moslem troops, who were loaded with spoil. But they did not venture to displease the soldiers by ordering them to abandon everything except their arms and war horses. and Abdurrahman trusted in the valor of his soldiers and in the good fortune which had ever attended him. But, the Arab writer remarks, such defeat of discipline always is fatal to armies. So, Abdurrahman and his host attacked Tours to gain still more spoil, and they fought against it so fiercely that they stormed the city almost before the eyes of the army that came to save it. And the fury and cruelty of the Muslims toward the inhabitants of the city were like the fury and cruelty of raging tigers. It was manifest, adds the Arab, that God's chastisement was sure to follow such excesses, and fortune thereupon turned her back upon the Moslems. Near the river Awar, the two great hosts of the two languages and the two creeds were set in array against each other. The hearts of Abdurrahman, his captains, and his men were filled with wrath and pride, and they were the first to begin the fight. The Moslem horsemen dashed fierce and frequent forward against the battalions of the Franks, who resisted manfully, and many fell dead on either side until the going down of the sun. Night parted the two armies, but in the gray of the morning the Moslems returned to the battle. Their cavaliers had soon hewn their way into the center of the Christian host. But many of the Moslems were fearful for the safety of the spoil which they had stored in their tents, and a false cry arose in their ranks that some of the enemy were plundering the camp. Whereupon several squadrons of the Moslem horsemen rode off to protect their tents. But it seemed as if they fled, and all the host was troubled. And while Abdurrahman strove to check their tumult and to lead them back to battle, the warriors of the Franks came around him, and he was pierced through with many spears, so that he died. Then all the host fled before the enemy, and many died in the flight. This deadly defeat of the Moslems and the loss of the great leader and a good cavalier Abdurrahman took place in the 115th year. It would be difficult to expect from an adversary a more explicit confession of having been thoroughly vanquished than the Arabs here accord to the Europeans. The points on which their narrative differs from those of the Christians, as to how many days the conflict lasted, whether the assailed city was actually rescued or not, and the like, are of little moment compared with the admitted great fact that there was a decisive trial of strength between the Frank and Saracen, in which the former conquered. The enduring importance of the Battle of Tours in the eyes of the Muslims is attested not only by the expressions of the deadly battle and the disgraceful overthrow, which their writers constantly employ when referring to it, but also by the fact that no further serious attempts to conquest beyond the Pyrenees were made by the Saracens. Charles Martel and his sons and grandson were left at leisure to consolidate and extend their power. The new Christian Roman Empire of the West, which the genius of Charlemagne founded, and throughout which his iron will imposed peace on the old anarchy of creeds and races, did not indeed retain its integrity after its great ruler's death. Fresh troubles came over Europe, but Christendom, though disunified, was safe. The progress of civilization and the development of the nationalities and governments of modern Europe from that time forth went forward not uninterrupted, but ultimately certain career. And that is all we have for the Battle of Tours. It's interesting that so many modern writers, historians, don't believe that the Battle of Tours was that big a deal. But the people closer to that time understood that the Battle of Tours prevented Europe from being overrun by Islam. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.